You have watched it happen. Someone you care about is making an obviously destructive decision. You can see exactly where it is heading. You have been there yourself, or you have watched someone else go through the same thing and you know with complete certainty how it ends. So you sit down with them, you lay out the logic clearly and carefully. You give them everything they need to see what you see, and they nod. They say you are probably right. They thank you for caring. And then they go home and do exactly what they were going to do before the conversation ever happened. And you are left wondering what the point was. Why do intelligent people ignore advice that could genuinely change their lives? Why does being given the right answer not produce the right behavior? Why does the gap between knowing and doing exist at all, and why is it so stubbornly wide in so many people for so many things? The answer is not that people are stupid. The answer is that the human brain is running a set of deeply wired psychological programs that treat good advice not as help but as threat. And once you understand those programs, you will never look at human resistance to change the same way again. Let us start with one of the most foundational concepts in all of social psychology: cognitive dissonance. Leon Festinger introduced this theory in 1957, and it remains one of the most well-supported and most practically important frameworks for understanding why people behave the way they do when their beliefs and their behaviors come into conflict. Cognitive dissonance is the psychological discomfort that arises when a person holds two contradictory pieces of information simultaneously, when what they believe about themselves conflicts with what they are doing, or when a piece of advice they are receiving conflicts with the choices they have already made. And here is the critical part that most people miss entirely. The brain does not experience this discomfort neutrally. It experiences it as a threat that must be eliminated. And it can eliminate it in one of two ways. It can change the behavior to match the belief, or it can change the belief to dismiss the threatening information. And the second option is almost always psychologically cheaper. Changing behavior requires sustained effort, discomfort, uncertainty, and the admission that what you were doing before was wrong. Dismissing the advice requires nothing more than a few seconds of mental reframing. The advice giver does not fully understand my situation. The logic sounds good, but it will not work for me specifically. They mean well, but they are being too simplistic. These are not conscious lies the person is telling themselves. They are the brain's automatic dissonance reduction machinery running exactly as it was designed to. The advice was never evaluated on its merits. It was rejected because accepting it would have required too much psychological restructuring. Now here is the layer that sits beneath cognitive dissonance and makes it even more resistant to simple logic. The ego. Not ego in the colloquial sense of arrogance, but ego in the psychological sense of the constructed self-narrative that every person carries about who they are, what they are capable of, and what their choices mean about their worth as a person. When someone receives advice, the brain does not only evaluate the advice itself, it simultaneously evaluates what accepting the advice implies about the person receiving it. And this implicit evaluation is where most advice dies quietly before it ever has a chance to change anything. If you have been in a relationship for 3 years and someone tells you it is unhealthy and you should leave, accepting that advice does not just mean changing your relationship status. It means accepting that you spent 3 years making a choice that was wrong for you, that you missed warning signs, that your judgment was flawed, that the story you have been telling yourself and everyone around you about this relationship was not true. The advice is not just information about the future. It is a retroactive rewrite of the past, and the ego will fight that rewrite with extraordinary tenacity because the self-narrative it protects is not just a preference. It is the psychological foundation on which a person's entire sense of identity rests. This is why the advice that is most obviously correct is often the most fiercely resisted. Because the more clearly correct it is, the more undeniable the implication becomes that accepting it is necessary. And the more necessary it becomes, the harder the ego fights to avoid the reckoning it would require. Let us talk about psychological reactance, because this is the mechanism that explains something that every advice giver eventually discovers with frustration. The harder you push someone toward a change, the more firmly they dig in against it. Jack Brem identified psychological reactance in 1966 as the motivational state that arises whenever a person perceives that their freedom to choose is being threatened or restricted, and it produces a specific and predictable response. the person moves more strongly toward exactly the position or behavior they are being pushed away from, not because they have carefully evaluated it and concluded it is correct, but because the act of being pushed activates a drive to reassert autonomy that overrides rational evaluation entirely. This is why unsolicited advice almost never works regardless of how accurate it is. Because the moment advice becomes pressure, it triggers reactance, and the person's brain stops evaluating the content of what is being said and starts resisting the perceived intrusion on their freedom to decide for themselves. The advice transforms from information into a control attempt in the receiver's perception, and nobody cooperates with control attempts. They resist them, even when resisting them is against their own best interest, even when they can see clearly that the resistance is costing them something real. The drive to be the author of your own choices is one of the most fundamental psychological needs human beings have, and it does not negotiate with logic when it feels threatened. Here is something that most advice givers never consider, and it changes everything about why the same advice lands for one person and gets completely rejected by another person in what appears to be an identical situation. The concept of readiness. Specifically what psychologists James Prohaska and Carlo Di Clemente called the stages of change model, which identifies that behavior change does not happen as a single event triggered by information. It happens as a process that moves through distinct psychological stages. In the first stage, which they called pre-contemplation, the person has not yet recognized that a problem exists or that change is necessary. In this stage, even the most perfect advice is invisible. The person's perceptual filters are set to reject it before it reaches conscious evaluation. In the second stage, contemplation, the person has begun to acknowledge that something might need to change, but they are not yet committed. In this stage, advice can penetrate but often produces ambivalence rather than action. Only when someone has moved through awareness and genuine motivation to the preparation and action stages does external advice have real traction. And here is the devastating implication for anyone who has tried to help someone who was not ready. You cannot advise someone into a stage of readiness they have not yet reached. The most accurate and compassionate guidance delivered to someone in pre-contemplation will bounce off completely, not because they are broken or stubborn, but because they are genuinely not yet at the psychological place where that information can be received. Timing is not secondary to the quality of advice. Timing is everything. Now let us add the layer of loss aversion, because this is where the neuroscience of decision-making intersects with everything we have been discussing to create a near-perfect psychological barrier against change. Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky's Nobel Prize-winning research on prospect theory demonstrated that the human brain does not evaluate gains and losses symmetrically. Losses feel approximately twice as powerful as equivalent gains. This means that the prospect of losing something you currently have generates roughly twice the psychological weight as the prospect of gaining something of equal value that you do not yet have. Now apply this to advice. When someone gives you advice that requires a significant life change, you are not just being offered a potential future gain. You are simultaneously being asked to give up something you currently have. Your current relationship, your current job, your current identity, your current routine, your current certainty. And the brain's loss aversion machinery assigns enormous psychological weight to those existing things precisely because they are known and possessed even when they are objectively harmful. The familiar painful thing carries a weight in the brain that the unfamiliar better thing cannot match simply because the unfamiliar thing does not yet feel real. It is a promise, and promises compete poorly against possessions in the neurological calculus of change. So what actually works? Because understanding all the ways advice fails is only useful if it points toward something that does not fail in the same ways. The most rigorously supported approach in behavioral change research is called motivational interviewing, and its core principle is a direct inversion of everything most people do when they try to help someone. Instead of providing the insight, you want them to have you ask questions designed to help them arrive at the insight themselves. The difference in outcome is profound, and it is psychologically predictable. When a person arrives at a conclusion through their own reasoning process, that conclusion becomes theirs. It does not threaten their ego because they generated it. It does not trigger reactance because no external force pushed them toward it. It does not collide with their self-narrative because it was produced by their own self-reflection. The psychologist does not say your relationship is unhealthy and you should leave. They ask, what would your life look like in 5 years if nothing changed? They ask what has staying cost you that you do not often let yourself think about. They create the conditions in which the person's own wisdom surfaces and delivers the message that no amount of external advice could have successfully transmitted. You are not giving them the answer. You are asking the questions that make the answer unavoidable from the inside. Here is the truth that ties all of this together, and it is one of the most important things you can understand about human beings, including yourself. People do not resist good advice because they are irrational. They resist it because they are human, because every piece of advice that challenges a current behavior is simultaneously a challenge to the identity that behavior has been supporting. Because autonomy is a fundamental psychological need that does not yield to even the most logical pressure. Because change requires grieving what was before, it can celebrate what will be, and that grief is real, and the brain resists initiating it. Because readiness cannot be imposed from outside, it can only be cultivated through the right questions and the right conditions, and enough time for the internal work to happen. Understanding this changes how you give advice. You stop lecturing and start asking. You stop pushing and start creating space. You stop measuring your success by whether someone followed your guidance and start measuring it by whether the conversation you had planted a seed of honest self-examination that might take weeks or months to bloom. And it changes how you receive advice. Because the next time you feel that familiar resistance rise up against something someone is telling you that is probably true, you will recognize it for what it is. Not evidence that the advice is wrong. Evidence that your brain is doing exactly what it was built to do. And you will have the awareness to pause and ask yourself the question that changes everything. Am I rejecting this because it is not right for me, or because accepting it would require me to become someone new? That question alone is worth more than 1,000 pieces of perfect advice.